All right, hello, welcome everybody. This is a webinar hosted by the SIR-RFS Research and Innovation Advisory Committee. Today we are discussing research funding for the IR trainee. My name is Savannah Fletcher. I'm a PGY1 doing my preliminary surgery intern year at St. Joseph Hospital in Denver, Colorado. I will be going to UCLA next year to start my integrated IR residency, and I will be moderating this webinar this evening. So just a quick rundown of the format for this webinar. The first half of the hour will include a presentation by a faculty speaker, and if there's time, we will have a Q&A session with him. During the second half of the webinar, we will have a panel of residents and medical students who have obtained in the past or currently have grant funding. I will pose a few questions for them and we will get to hear their insights. If there is time, we'll ask them some questions from the audience as well. And in order for us to know the audience questions, we'll have you guys type questions into the question box on the right side of the screen. So if you guys can place your questions there. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll see them and we can ask the panelists these questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our faculty speaker, Dr. Erik Cressman. Dr. Cressman is an assistant professor of interventional radiology at UT MD Anderson Cancer Center and director of the Dunn Center for Radiological Sciences. He also serves as the research advisor for the UT MDACC GSBS PhD Advisory Committee. He is the chair for the SIR Grants and Research Division and is the president of the Society of Thermal Medicine. His research interests include tumor heterogeneity and metabolism, thermochemistry, cell stress, cancer immunology, thermal imaging, and mass spectrometry imaging. His clinical interests include embolization and ablation, focused on primary liver cancer and metastatic disease. He has received grant funding from multiple sources, including the NIH and NCI, the IRG, Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of Texas, and Bridge funding support. So welcome, Dr. Cressman. We're very excited to hear from you.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Well, thank you. Let's see here. Is that now full screen? Oh, here we are. All right.
I didn't see the presenter. Perfect.
All right, so does everybody see the SR-71? Big Blackbird? I hope that's, are we?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. All right, so thank you for that introduction. We have a whole lot of ground to cover and we're gonna go very quickly. I hope we can get it all done in the amount of time that I've got available. Of course, this airplane is one of my favorites, but it epitomizes the approach we're gonna take here, fast and very big picture. So those of you that know me know I'm full of a lot of things, but one of them is analogies, and we're going to use several along the way with some movie references that I hope you'll be able to catch. If there are questions, I do have to leave. I'm sorry I can't stick around for the entire thing. I'd love to, but the rest of the crew will handle those in some fashion, and I'll be able to, I'll help everybody as best as I'm able after the fact if we can get it all sorted out. All right, so in terms of overall strategy, what I really want you to do is stop thinking like an interventional radiologist. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, that would be it. We all know a lot of clinical medicine, but we don't all know a lot about research, and we do not have a culture like other specialties do. And I hope you'll be able to see what I mean about thinking outside of the box or even outside of the time-space continuum in a way, figuratively speaking. All right, so let's see here. A couple of disclosures, you heard about that already. We're gonna roughly adhere to this outline, evaluating yourself, an idea, getting some guidance and training, how to design a project, some problems and flaws and examples of things, and funding and communicating. So it's not really gonna be just about funding per se, but obviously that's a big, big piece of it. So the first question I have for you guys is, why are you doing this? And, you know, this is for posterity, so be honest. If you are really, really, really curious, that's the kind of person you need to be, because you're going to have to deal with a lot of setbacks here and there. But it's just it's that person that's got the fire in their belly that really wants to do something. That's what we need. If you just want to buff up your CV with research publications, well, I mean, look, people, you've already matched into radiology and interventional radiology. This is one of the most competitive things anyway. What else are you going to do? I don't think you need to do that to buff up your CV at this stage. You've gotten past the worst of that. So if you want to make a meaningful contribution to patient care, you can still do that a lot of different ways, including in clinical research. My bias, of course, is towards basic and translational stuff, but there's no thing that I know of that really compares to the satisfaction of working on your own ideas. So if you work backwards, you have to think about what is your overall goal and think really big. Remember I said, think beyond interventional radiology here. And then work back to say, okay, well, what funding is going to get us to that big picture? Then you can take a step back and say, what papers are going to help you get the funding? What data do you need to publish those papers? What pilot grant do you need to get those data? And then what experiments will get you started? So I won't flog the chemistry references too hard here, but what I really want you to do then is play to your strengths. What do you already know about? What's a place that you can begin building something from? What do you care about? What are you passionate about? This question about what's your institution known for, some of that can be handled in the sense of where you're at right now and who your mentors are, but some of it's going to depend on where you end up for your career, so that's going to determine what the resources are that are readily available. And that's an important piece. So you're going to need to think long-term strategically about where you want to end up and what size of an institution and what number of support faculty, what number of trainees, what number of collaborators versus where you're going to live and so on. Then, of course, you're going to have to look in the future and say, well, how's this all going to work out? But again, in thinking bigger, it's okay, particularly at this stage of training, to think, okay, let's start with an idea about how did we do this and how did we do with this. That's kind of in the retrospective chart review kind of thing. Or another idea is, well, you know, what else can we do with this? Like, let's say we've got a new stent, where else can we put it, and then report on that. That's okay. But if you really want to build a research program, it should not stay there. It needs to be much, much deeper than that. I'll get into that shortly. So here you are trying to think about what kind of idea I'm going to have, and it may or may not work. It's really hard to figure out because so many other people know so much, and then you go, oh, wow, I've got an idea. Then you do a little bit more literature searching now that you have the focus of that idea, and you realize that several people have already published that idea. That is not the time to get depressed about it, actually. That is the time to look at it and go, okay, I now have the same amount of information that somebody else already had earlier, but importantly, my thought process was correct. And that's what really matters here. So what you really need to do then is, once that's sorted out in your mind and you've moved on, then you have to think about what is the question underneath the question that you were looking at. Then you're going to have to repeat that process and say, okay, well, that's all well and good, but what's the question under that question? And you have to repeat and go through this cycle several times, and each time you're going to get to something deeper and broader, and eventually get something that's useful to other people in other fields of science and medicine that they can relate to. All right, so I put this one in just to give you an idea. What's the difference between significance and impact? Because it's really hard to draw this stuff out of what's available on NIH website pages. So significance is really how big is the problem that you're taking on, and impact is really how much change is what you're proposing going to have on that problem. And obviously, if you were looking at, like in both of these graphs, the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is going to be, say, survival. You don't want to be the one on the left side, because within standard deviation and margins of error and so on and so forth, you're really not making any difference. You're looking for something that's going to be much more like what's over on the right-hand side. Okay, this next one, I apologize for the difficulty with the text, but it's funny enough and makes the point about your own ideas and how you feel about them that I'm going to go ahead and read it. It says, the burden of bringing the truth to the ignorant masses is both heavy and complicated. The key is not just what you say, it's how you say it. Problem is, people sometimes confuse my confident righteousness for arrogance, at which point they stop listening. If I were to communicate in a humble, less aggressive manner, I wonder if I might be more effective. But then again, humility in the face of my overwhelming genius would obviously amount to hypocrisy. I'm sorry, were you saying something? All right, so moving on to something that's a little bit different. I pulled this one out just to make the point, again, to not stay in the same pond, get an idea that's somewhere a little bit off the beaten path. I've got the next pictures are going to show the same thing to reinforce it in a different way. You don't want to be part of this stampede. For example, a few years ago, it was nanoparticles, and that one's tapering off a little bit now. Now it's the immune system. And at your guys' stage of the career, you'd want to have some really strong backing to be able to get into that with some intelligent strategy. You'd be much better suited to be like this guy down in the fly fishing where he's away from where all the other crowd is. See if you can find something like that that does have an impact on things at a much deeper level than just changing the catheter size or the shape of the catheter or a new needle or something like that. So another way to look at this, again, where the time axis, on the y-axis, you could think about the level of interest or enthusiasm, the number of people that are out there working on it, which is basically your competition, and the amount of money that's going out there. And when you're at the stage of what's labeled A on this graph, you'll find that it's a little bit hard to persuade people to give you the money because people just can't wrap their brains around what you're talking about. You want to be in that sweet spot at B where enough people recognize it, but there's not too many people out there clamoring for the same dollars that you want. And then by the time you get to C, that's where all the big groups have already got all their established work done, and you really better have a good reason to plow into some new field when it's getting to this stage if you're going to be successful. All right, I know you guys are going to talk about this later, but I felt obligated to put it in because it is so important. And the reason I said find one, then another, and yet another is because no one mentor is going to be able to handle all the different scenarios and situations that you need. You have to get whoever you're going to need for your situation. Once you have that in place, then you have something going. You can actually spend a little bit of time, make sure these people know that they are important to you and that you take their input seriously and that you follow up on it. Because having that kind of support can make a massive difference in how things turn out for you down the road. And along those lines, I'll make a plug for what we're calling our proposal development form, which is a new tool that we've developed through the SIR Foundation. And it is not meant to you have to have a finished draft to submit. The point is, how do you start out early before you even have a full proposal written and make sure that everything is lined up and in place and scaled appropriately before you go into the details? And the purpose is really to develop what we call the aims page, and that's the one page that everybody in a grant review panel is supposed to read. Not everybody does, even in spite of that. But it's your chance to do the best sales job ever for the idea that you want. But the form is developed to help streamline your thinking and get you the first round of how do you pull all the pieces together. And right now we've got it as a requirement for the pilot grants and for the Ring Faculty Development Award. We're still working on whether or not we're going to drop it down into lower tiers of award value and earlier in training because there's a lot of logistics that go with it. But the idea is to set a deadline much earlier, like the middle of June. And the point is so that we can line you up with somebody who knows the same area, but somebody who's got lots of experience that can help give you some advice. That's a little bit like, okay, we've got a ship architect who's going to help you line up the keel and make sure that if you're going to put a boat in the water at some point, that it might actually have a chance to float. So some outside training that I'm going to mention here. HIPAA, everybody probably is already familiar with. RCR stands for Responsible Conduct of Research. If you're working in an animal lab, you probably are going to have to document some training on how to work with rats or mice or pigs or whatever, or rabbits. Lab safety is going to be a standard kind of thing, particularly in the animal lab, so you don't get zoonoses and things like that. Statistics I'm going to talk about a little bit too, but it helps to get training there. And literature, because I find that a lot of people still really don't have a good grasp of how to set up an area that they're going to become more expert in and get regular reinforcement of it. So what you can do on the HIPAA is look at this website for the responsible conduct of research. You can look at the cityprogram.org. That's an organization that actually recognizes that lots of institutions have a lot of the same training requirements. So they agreed to bring it all into one place. And I just checked that website again this evening, and they had added a couple of new courses that you can take. It's a really, really good resource. They even have statistics modules that are really very basic, but still very good. Anybody that's working with animals is also going to need to have additional training based on their own institutional animal care and use committee requirements. If you're working in a lab, then you're going to have chemical safety or waste management type issues. If you're working with radioisotopes, there's bound to be some extra training you're going to have to do for that. Same thing with recombinant DNA, depending on biosafety levels or whatever else you're going to be working on. And of course, you're going to want to try to stay current with some of these things. All right, so ways to get a handle on this are work with your librarians, learn how to use the Ovid, PubMed, Medline databases, and work on learning how to use auto alerts and citation alerts. Use the Web of Science, which used to be called Science Citation Index. There's lots of bibliographic software out there that can help you keep track of things, and get into some societies besides the Society of Interventional Radiology, something that's in an area that you're interested in, and you'll find people who are hungry to talk to physicians. It's a really great way to start building a community outside of a narrow world that we live in. It's almost like an echo chamber in some cases, but I'm not going to belabor that point. Anyhow, there are a number of enterprising individuals that have set up grant writing workshops or seminars, things like that. If you see an advertisement for one of those and your schedule allows, I would recommend signing up early for those, because there are a lot of people who are PhDs and are very hungry to survive because they don't have the option of doing clinical work to pay the bills. So those tend to fill up very early. All right, typical components for a grant proposal. Just to give you an idea if you've never seen this kind of thing before, I did mention the Aims page before. That's the single most important page. I'll put that there just to emphasize that again. That's the one that's going to have your main hypothesis, the background funneling down into what you're working on, and then 2 or maybe 3 at most what we call aims, and these are tasks or goals that are going to test some aspect of your hypothesis. More recently, like in the last couple of years, the NIH has changed that background and significance section. Once you get into the body of the actual proposal or the approach, instead of having a background in significance, they now call this the overall premise, and each aim should have a premise. And that's basically what's the basis in the literature for what you're doing. And they also require a quality assessment of the literature that you cite. So you're going to want to pick the best possible literature out there, show that it's the best that's out there, and it still leaves open this gap or this hole in knowledge that we're going to be needing to fill. Depending on the format, you may have a separate section for preliminary data. Otherwise, you're going to have to work it in one way or another into your research, design, and methods. Everybody's going to want to see something about statistics and a plan for analyzing your data, and always thinking about what else could go wrong and what you might do about it, but that should be a small area. And NIH recently added this annoying thing called rigor and another one called sex as a biological variable. And rigor is basically showing how you're going to do things so that they are going to be repeatable in the hands of somebody else in another lab, or that you can do it multiple times, things like that. All right, in terms of timelines, here's a list, but the reality is that it's going to be months to a year or more, and a lot of this goes into the conception, and actually I would spend, out of this entire time, probably half of it is on your Aims page. because a lot of the rest of it is details that will fall into place very quickly, but if you don't have the keel of the ship laid down straight, nothing's going to work. So the whole cycle can take actually longer than you think. Now, you may or may not be a Harry Potter fan, but you may recognize Voldemort. In terms of statistics, you have to figure out how big is the difference you're looking for and how much in the way of resources is it going to take to be reliably able to detect that difference. And that's where you can get to where a big failure that's very common. R.A. Fisher is the guy that was the Fisher of Fisher's exact test, and even back in the 1920s and 30s, he was looking at all this stuff, and he said, you know, this is basically the same as doing a post-mortem after your experiment. He can tell you what the experiment died of. So I threw a link in there just for one place where somebody put in a power size calculator, but there are plenty of those on the internet. So in terms of moving along here, sorry I have to go so fast about this, but with problems, you really need to anticipate a few and recognize that research goes slowly already, and when you run into problems, they slow you down even more. One of my graduate students is right in the middle of all of this, and I keep telling her, you got to work in multi-track things and never wait for somebody else to finish something. You got to have your next plan ready to go as fast as possible. But if you think about some of this stuff ahead of time, it just won't delay you as much as it otherwise would. And don't be afraid to get input from others. Fatal flaws are what reviewers are going to look for. These are weaknesses in the structure or logic of a project or in the actual execution. So in terms of persuading others, that's the reviewers, you need to recognize how critical people can be. Scientists can sometimes be downright vicious in terms of trying to defend their own stuff versus somebody else. There's a YouTube on scientific peer review circa 1945 where they've put the subtitles in for Hitler down in the bunkers towards the end of World War II. Many people have sort of grabbed onto this meme. It's probably a couple, 3 years old at least, to take this scolding kind of thing and put different kinds of subtitles in there for different stories, but it's really worth a read. All right, so where did I learn about all this stuff? Actually, not at SIR. That's where I'm saying you need to get involved with other societies. You need to find people that are PhDs who are experienced, who are willing to give you more than just a brief glance at the time of day. And that's what's going to help you broaden your mind and think about things in a deeper way that I hope I've emphasized over and over here. And the one analogy I thought about, which I'm going to get onto here momentarily, if you think about the electromagnetic spectrum, it's very easy in interventional radiology to be thinking basically at a single wavelength, like 456 nanometers or something like that. You take your problem and look at it from the general practitioner point of view, and they may be looking at the entire spectrum and thinking about all the parts of a problem that come together to get to where they are, to where they actually contacted you. All right, now let's use an analogy here with Charlie Daughter. Presumably everybody knows who he is or was. Back in 1964, let's imagine that he was the one that came up with the idea that said, hey, I wonder if I took a piece of paper or maybe a bit of fabric and I stuffed some frosting in there, I could actually decorate a cake. This is called a pastry bag by some people. So then they got real excited about how they could do something differently, and they said, oh, wow, we could do something with different colors. Then the next thing was, well, what if we did something even more fancy and we added a bunch of different tip shapes? Then everybody would go, wow, this is really cool. And then well, we can even go beyond fancy tip shapes. We can now get extruding fancy tip shapes. And then now you get to today where we have a stainless steel power auger mechanism to have even tighter control over what you're doing. That's basically what interventional radiology has done over the last, I don't know, 40 years or so, 50 years. So who are we anyway? Well, at this stage, I think it's fair to say that if you think of everybody in training as like these young chefs that are working on something here, they're learning how to do one task in front of them, which is all well and good. But we're really cake decorators. We've learned through what Charlie Daughter started out with and has evolved. We can make the fanciest cakes and fanciest gingerbread houses you can ever imagine. That's all well and good, and it's to be appreciated for sure, but not everybody wants a really, really fancy dessert, and some people are happy with just the cake and no frosting. So, where do you go from there? You're going to have to open your mind. Other people in other specialties are thinking in the context of an entire meal, an entire evening. They're going from hors d'oeuvres all the way to coffee. This is going to be the competition at the level that you're dealing with at the NIH, because they're looking at problems that are big enough to have an impact on a large number of people. So what that really means is, instead of being a cake decorator, we need to think about this. And you've got a whole lot of stuff to learn about here. The appetizers, floral displays, table service, lighting, ambience, china patterns, salad and soup, cheese selections. Oh, but then there's wine pairings, background music, seating order, entree, dessert, coffee, tea, aperitif. Here we are, experts at cake decorating. So the context has to be considered, and we need to be much, much bigger in terms of how we think. We think, as a first step, think about all desserts, not just decorating cakes or maybe cookies or cupcakes or whatever. How does it fit with the entire dinner? If you can apply your creativity to more than just desserts, you guys are all creative people, or you wouldn't be here. You can apply your creativity to the entire evening. That's what you got to think about, because these reviewers are going to be there, and this is how they're going to look at it as well. So, in terms of developing a thick skin with reviewer comments, you're going to need it. I can tell you from personal experience, because I had, by the way, with the NIH on their scales, the lower the number for the percentile, the better. That's kind of the opposite of what people are usually used to for scoring tests, for example, or scoring a candidate on a national exam or whatever. So at the National Cancer Institute, a almost guaranteed fund at the pay line is like the 9th percentile, and probably getting funded is maybe the 14th, somewhere in that range. I had a proposal that went from the 15th percentile to the next round. It got triaged. So there you can think, crown or not, that's where I'm at right now. So try not to get too upset about it. It's going to happen. There's plenty of reasons. There may be some validity in the reviewer's criticisms. You got to read between the lines and be professional about it and address everything. So what are fatal flaws? Novel but not enough impact. Hypothesis is not well developed. I always hated reading this one, but it's hard to explain, but when you get enough experience looking at various hypotheses and you see one, then you have a better idea. Stacking your aims is a common one. It's where aim 2 depends on the successful outcome of aim 1, and aim 1 might not turn out successfully. You got to structure them in a way that no matter how they turn out, you'll get an answer, but on top of that, each aim cannot depend on one of the others. A major gap in your preliminary data showing that you can do something is a problem. Leaving out some of the other more obvious aspects, leaving out alternatives, lack of long-term goals, those kinds of things. Or the worst one is if somebody says, well, so-and-so's already done this. You went to a lot of work for nothing. All right, so some of you may recognize this is what we call a Trojan rabbit. And this is from the Monty Python movie, The Holy Grail. So if you consider the concepts and the execution, if this was a proposal to get a Holy Grail, and so the whole grant is focused on getting that, and aim 1 is capture the castle. Then you've got a knight, Sir Bedivere, who invents the strategy or adapts the strategy. He's obviously spent a lot of time on this, and you can clearly tell it's a rabbit. So a reviewer, however, is not worried about things that you would spend all your time on, like the diameter of the wheels and the number of guys needed to push it, and whether you did a good literature review on the different kinds of wood that you might have been able to use to make the rabbit. They're going to take in the big picture and recognize the fatal flaw, which is here. These guys are supposed to be inside the rabbit, and the king has just asked Sir Bedivere, so how are you going to do this? And he says, well, now Launcelot, Galahad, and I wait until nightfall, then leap out of the rabbit, taking the French by surprise, not only by surprise, but totally unarmed. And you can see they've connected the dots there. The reviewers are going to see a problem at that level. So their response is pretty predictable. They'll take that in, look it over, And the next thing you know, there's your proposal laying there in shambles. And this is now time to go back to the drawing board and not, for those of you who have seen the movie, to come up with an idea that involves an enormous wooden badger. But again, I'm not going to flog that. All right, I got to wrap up here pretty quickly. So with funding, you're going to want to start with a small pilot scale project, build a published record for credibility, get some advice on how to lay out some realistic timelines. Recognize that in larger grants, really most of the money goes to pay salaries and fringe benefits, which is why the administrators like it so much. And indirect costs from large organizations like the NIH will have an additional anywhere from 40 to 60 cents on the dollar that goes straight to the institution. The other point I want to make about deadlines is that a lot of times they're actually the one where the institution will submit the proposal on your behalf, which means they want to see it about a week ahead, sometimes even more. And be aware that your IACUC and your institutional review board typically meet only once a month. All right, peer-reviewed versus industry is a question that comes up fairly often. Peer-reviewed, of course, is your own ideas, build credibility for you. It allows you to plan a trajectory, gives you some long-term stability and depth, has potential for high impact, involves a lot of hard work, but you can actually move the needle. Industry is convenient, it's nice, it's prepackaged, but you don't have any ownership. And I've seen funding vanish in a moment with a buyout, a takeover, a new chief executive officer, or maybe the market shifts or the government changes the regulations, and then boom, the project is no longer relevant. So you don't have stability, and sometimes you don't have even an option to publish. Communicating results, just very quickly, I'll put a plug in for reading Jim Reeker's book. It's called Presenting at Medical Meetings. It's not a long book at all. It's probably, I don't know, maybe 80 or 120 pages, something like that, but it's a very small one and it's very fast, easy read. Putting posters together, again, I'm not going to spend much time on that. I think there's a lot of examples online. There's a lot of people out there with opinions on how to do that the most effectively, but you may be handcuffed because your institution may have branding restrictions or require templates. So it's nice if you can take some of those later, build a actual publication off of them. So that's pretty standard. And that pretty much wraps it up. So I would say you can do it. All right.
That was awesome. Thank you, Dr. Cressman. What a great talk. So I think you have to head out for another engagement, unfortunately, and won't have time for questions, correct?
Correct. But I will be happy to help you guys out if you want to like collect a bunch of questions or however it plays out in the end.
Okay.
Just let me know.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your time. Know you're very busy. And that was a wonderful talk.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. So with that, now we can move on to our panel discussion. And if you guys do have any questions for him, you can type them into the question box and maybe somehow we can get those answered by him later. But for now, we will start our panel discussion. So first, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have 5 panelists tonight, 3 residents, including myself, and then 2 medical students, all who have either previously obtained grant funding or currently have grant funding, and they will be sharing with you their valuable insights on this topic. So welcome, panelists. I'll just have each of you introduce yourselves. We'll start with Dania, and then we'll just kind of go in order of the photographs.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Dania Daye. I am a 4th-year resident at MGH. And previously, I have gotten the RSNA medical student grant and the RSNA resident grant currently.
Andrew.
Hi guys, my name is Andrew Niekamp. I am a 4th-year radiology resident, PGY 5, down here at UT Houston with Dr. Cressman. I'm going to be doing my fellowship at Miami Vascular, and I have a current grant funding through the SIR Resident Research Award.
And I am Savannah Fletcher. I'm the moderator tonight. I am a first-year resident doing my general surgery prelim year. I previously had the SIR Foundation Summer Medical Student Internship program grant. Francesca, are you with us?
Oh, sorry, I can't see the screen, so I don't know what is going on. But I'm Francesca Lobianco. I'm a second-year medical student in the MD PhD program at University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. I received the SIR Foundation Summer Medical Student Internship this past summer.
Can you all see my screen now?
I don't.
You had it there for a second, but now it's white. There it is.
I apologize.
So I guess that leaves me. This is Adam Swersky. I'm a third-year medical student at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, and I've received the Dr. and Mrs. W.C. Colt Medical Student Grant from the SIR Foundation.
Awesome. All right, so now we'll start with our questions. The first question is about mentorship. So how to find a mentor and why is finding a mentor important?
Savannah, I can take this. This is Dania.
Okay.
I mean, I think to me, finding a mentor is actually the most important part of any research project. And some of the tips that I've gotten as I was starting and doing research is that, first of all, you have to know yourself. So you need to know if you're the kind of person who really wants a lot of guidance and wants a mentor who's more available versus you're someone who will take more initiative and has a lot of research experience, and you're okay working with someone who has a less time available to hold your hand and guide you through the process. The second most important thing that I would say about mentorship is it's extremely important for you to look for the track record of the person who you're looking to mentor you. And what I usually do when I'm looking for a mentor is I go and talk to people who have worked with that person before, be it residents, medical students, graduate students. Those are the best people to tell you how good of a mentor that person is. And things to look for is, what is their track record in terms of allowing you to publish, allowing you to be a first author on a publication, allowing you to go present at conferences? How many times have people who have worked with him or her have been able to do that during the time that they've worked with that person? Because remember, I mean, having the right mentor is one of the more important things in terms of making sure that you can get to the next steps, either through letters of recommendations or really having the track record that you've accomplished something during the research time that you've spent with that person.
Yeah, I completely agree. This is Andy jumping in. Completely agree with everything with Dania. I think like she said, it'll definitely make or break you, and it's something that's really important that you're going to need to take seriously. But another thing that's really important that I think everybody needs to know is you're not married to this to a mentor, and if things are not actually working out, it's not out of the realm to try to find somebody that can actually try to move to somebody else and really find somebody who's going to help you. So if you do find a mentor and it doesn't seem to be working out, do not feel like you're stuck. There are options to move around and try to find somebody else to help you out.
This is Adam. I also want to point out that mentors can come from so many different places, not even just the institution that you're at. When you go to conferences like SIR and whatnot, you can get, you can have mentors at all different levels, all different stages, not just strictly for specifically completing a project, but really all these people are out there at different stages in their careers, and they can provide so many different perspectives on what you might be trying to accomplish. So I'd really encourage everybody to just consider all the people you meet as potential mentors, and you never know what might happen from those conversations.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. This is Francesca. And honestly, all it takes to start finding a mentor is to send an email. If they're on your campus, just shoot them an email. If somebody is interested and they find out that someone else is interested in what they like, they're definitely going to want to talk to you. And if they don't have time to talk with you, then maybe ask for maybe somebody else in their field that you would be able to learn from, or do you know of anybody that's interested in this topic? You don't have to, you know, hang yourself on one person. You can ask for maybe they have some friends that are in this other field that you were thinking about. But honestly, it takes an email and that starts a conversation.
Yeah, those are all really awesome points. I agree that, you know, it's good to talk to other people who have had this mentor before, and they're good resources to give you advice on whether or not that person would be a good mentor for you. And I think it is important, like Dr. Cressman pointed out, that you can have multiple mentors who have maybe different backgrounds, or you go to them for different reasons. I know I have multiple, and really it takes a village. Any other comments on mentorship? Okay. We'll move on to the next question. Oh, well, I prepared a few points. So just a few things I thought about for finding a mentor. Reach out to IRs at your institution. If your institution doesn't have any interventional radiologists, then there's always the SIR mentor match, which I know has been very helpful in finding mentors in IR. Even if you already have interventional radiologists at your own institution, you can use the SIR mentor match because, like I said, you can never have too many mentors. Also getting involved in the interventional radiology interest groups, the radiology interest groups at your institution, or going to regional symposia. You can meet all sorts of faculty who I'm sure will be excited to take you on as a mentee. You can go to the SIR and RSNA annual meetings where there's many faculty there. And then also through the RFS, you can find plenty of mentors who maybe are other residents or other fellows, and you can find people that can lead you in the right direction. So our next topic is how to choose a grant to apply for. So how did you guys kind of look and see what grants were available and decide which one you wanted to apply for?
So I think obviously, you know, try to choose something that's going to be an area of interest for you. And then you'll be surprised how many opportunities there are out there. And actually, you'll be surprised, you know, RSNA grants are, you know, you can apply to those with a diverse bunch of ideas. You know, once you start getting into SIR grants, obviously those are going to be more limited to interventional topics, but still the amount of the array of things that they do accept are very wide. So, you know, just try to kind of narrow it down with what you're interested in, would be my advice.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Andy just said. I mean, I think it is important to know that there are a lot of grants available out there, and you have to choose the one that best fits your project. For us in radiology, I would say the top two sources for grants for medical students and residents are going to be RSNA and SIR. So for me, as a medical student, I applied for an RSNA grant, which was about $8,000 during my fourth year. And that was really instrumental in terms of allowing me to get some preliminary data for a larger grant that we ended up applying for. And for the resident grant for RSNA, it gives about $30,000, where you can actually hire your own research assistant and really do a much bigger project. And it gives you about 6 months of protected research time during residency. So you have to really think about the scale of the project that you have and how much money you really need, and then go and look between RSNA and SIR specifically, which one best fits the project that you want to work on. And I would then say find a mentor who has had a track record of successful funding in terms of residents or medical students working with them, because there are certainly some intricacies about applying for those grants that would be very helpful to have someone who have done this before to help you with that process.
I would also add that some people that can be really helpful in this process, and like you're saying, you definitely want to know what kind of money you're going for and how much money you need to accomplish your goals and accomplish your idea. And I think you need to be realistic about that. But some people that can be really helpful are the research department personnel at your institution who have a lot of experience depending on where you are. But that could also be in other departments as well if there isn't an IR radiology department with that kind of experience. But people who know about funding, running research projects, running clinical research, doing that sort of thing, knowing where the money comes from and what kind of agreements you need with the university and industry and whatever it might be, those people can really help you narrow down, and they might even have ideas as to where you might apply for certain grants.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So just a few points that I thought of. So kind of like Dania said, the main places that as medical students and residents we'll be looking at are the SIR and the RSNA and maybe even NIH grants. So that's one place to start. And then within there's certain grants available based on your level of training. So there's certain medical student grants and there's certain resident grants. And then there's even more delineations from there. So then from there, you should also think about the type of research experience you have and the type of research experience you want to have, the type of project that you're interested in doing, the time commitment. There's certain grants that require a specific time commitment, so you really need to think about what kind of time you're willing to put in. If you're able to take 6 months, if you're not, if you're able to take a whole summer, if you're not. So those important considerations to have. And then also, obviously, which research area you are interested in. So these are all considerations and kind of go into the decision to apply for a specific grant.
And Savannah, if I can just add very briefly, I think it's very important for people to also think about how competitive their projects is. In terms of there are different funding lines for different societies and institutions. So for example, the NIH would probably be for someone who has substantial research time and a very big project with a lot of preliminary data. The RSNA will be with a little bit of preliminary data, probably will take 6 months of work before you can apply for the grant. And I'm not sure SIR is how SIR works. So maybe if Andy or Adam, or someone who has gotten SIR grants can comment about how much preliminary data will be needed for that.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, I can comment on that in that I didn't have any preliminary data for my grant in that I didn't produce any data. But obviously, the idea has to be supported by the literature and whatnot, but there was no requirement for that for the grant that I received.
All right. So the next step, once you've decided for which grant you are going to apply, is how to even apply. What all goes into an application?
So I can start by commenting about RSNA grants. So I will preface this by saying that there are definitely quite a few documents that have to be ready to have a completed packet to submit. So typically the RSNA deadlines are in January for resident grants and I believe at the beginning of February for medical student grants. In addition to writing a research proposal, which ranges anywhere between 4 to 6 pages, you also need to get letters of support from people you're collaborating with, for example. You do not need any recommendation letters for RSNA from your mentors, but there has to be a small paragraph about their background. You have to include your CV, your mentors' CVs, and then you have to learn how to write a budget. that can be approved by RSNA to support your work. So I would say in terms of timeline for how much before you need to start, I would say for the preliminary data component, you need to start at least, I would say about 4 months, if not a little bit before, if you do not have any preliminary data at all. There are some instances where people have been able to get RSNA grants without preliminary data, but I would say those are probably very, very rare. The funding rate for RSNA this year was, I believe, about 35%. So they approve 1 out of every 3rd grant that gets submitted. I would say for the rest of the documents that you would need, I would start probably September, October to assemble everything that you need so you're ready to submit by their deadline.
So some of those things that she's referring to, that I wasn't aware of until I started looking at these grants, and definitely, to reflect on something that Dr. Cressman mentioned, he mentioned working on the Ames page for about half the time. I would say that goes for a lot of different things. I felt that the earlier that I knew about certain requirements for the grant, the easier it was later on when I already had a rough draft of all these things. And some of them were first time things for me as a medical student, such as a biosketch, which is something I was unfamiliar with. But, going to people that were more experienced in putting these kind of documents together, I was able to do that neatly and organized and put together a good one for myself. Some grants require personal statements or personal statements related to the idea. I've applied to RSNA grants that have required that. And as she also mentioned, certain letters of recommendation from department chairs and signatures that you might need to obtain. You always want to make sure to be able to do that in a timely manner so you're not rushing to do it at the end. So I'd say, starting as early as you can, at least defining all the things that you need to do and trying to estimate how long each of these little extra ancillary things will take you will just make your life a lot easier when you really want to be focusing on the content of your proposal and perfecting the language of your Ames page to sell your idea to the reviewers.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. That really the timeline cannot be stressed enough. Being sure that you give yourself plenty of time. Honestly, I feel like I always underestimate how much time things are going to take. The main points that I had pointed out, the application's typically online. You'll often need to be a member of the society. I know for the RSNA and the SIR, that is a requirement, which is easy to join. Typically, the application will involve letters of recommendation or support, and this is kind of where having a mentor and having a good relationship with the department that you plan to do research in comes in handy. You'll need a project advisor. Again, if this isn't your mentor, hopefully your mentor can steer you in the right direction to finding an advisor for the project that you're wanting to complete. You'll have to have a detailed research plan and a project budget. Again, this is something that, if you don't know how to do, you can get help from your mentor or your advisor. Going along or back to this timeline theme is just being aware of the application deadline and how long things are going to take you. Often you're going to need preliminary data before you apply. So that's something you need to look into beforehand. Do you guys have any more points on this? All right. Moving on. So what to expect from the experience? What can you guys tell our listeners about what to expect once you have a grant?
Yeah, I would say it's certainly a very rewarding experience. It really puts you in a position where you learn how to be on your way to becoming an independent investigator, eventually applying for NIH grant if this is your interest. So I would say overall it's a very good experience to have if you have interest in research.
Well, just a few things that I thought about with this question. So like we mentioned before, a lot of the grants involve a specific time commitment. So the grant that I received, it was a specific 8-week time commitment. I know other grants involve six months. I'm sure other ones can involve, longer periods of time than that. So you have to be aware of that and be ready to commit to that. Some of the grants could involve some clinical experience. I know the SIR summer medical student internship did, but it was varied depending on which clinical site you were at. I know there are certain stipulations for funding, like you have to complete certain requirements in order to get the funding. A lot of the grants can involve progress reports, so maybe every week or every 2 weeks, you would have to report back to the institution what kind of progress you've made on your project. And then oftentimes there's a final report that's required as well. So then at the end too, a lot of times it's expected that you'll submit an abstract to either an annual meeting or some other meeting, and then eventually it's thought that you'll submit a manuscript. And then a lot of grants will require that you attend an annual meeting. And so our final question is, how can a research grant be beneficial to my career? How does it affect my career trajectory?
I mean, I think there are many ways that a research grant can be helpful. So I would say for those of us at the end of residency and more senior, it is not very uncommon for people to use these grants to generate preliminary data that they will take with them to their first faculty job as they're trying to negotiate research time and start larger projects that will define the research direction of their career. So these tend to be a very good time investment, and also they show that you have a track record of being funded, so that will improve your job prospects in terms of being able to find a job that will give you more academic time as you're starting in that direction.
Awesome.
I would say from a research perspective too, I found it really interesting that you could take an idea from the bare bones of an idea, and writing a grant is a lot more involved than, say, doing a case report or a case series or even writing a paper. I guess you kind of have to own your idea so much that you kind of have to become one with it. And I think it really taught me a lot about the research process itself, and looking back on even writing the grant and now following through with it, it's just, there's a lot you can learn about the ins and outs of research that I think will definitely benefit me going forward in the future. And that doesn't even include the logistics of things. It even includes, your own habits and how you work, how you organize your computer, and how you do literature searches and all that kind of stuff that Dr. Cressman was referring to. I think it just taught me how to be more efficient with how I handle my own business.
Awesome. Just a couple things that I thought about. Having a research grant, it helps you to learn more about the field, it helps you to network and build your resume. So with that, just to respect everybody's time, I think we're going to conclude the webinar. I do not think we have any time for questions, unfortunately, but I would really like to thank the panelists for taking the time to participate in this webinar, and thank you listeners for joining in. We really hope that this was a useful hour for you guys, and I would just like everyone to have a good night.
right, thanks, Savannah. Good night, everyone.
Yes.
Thank you, Savannah.
Thank you, Savannah, for having me. This was fun.